Easy Explain Ethics by Spinoza, fifth part of Human Freedom. So the full title of this part is Of the Power of the Intellect or On Human Freedom. So Spinoza here is really going to start to focus on how we can use the power of reason, how we can use our mind to get control over the effects, to manage them, to understand them, to find this freedom that he describes. So we're going to jump to Proposition 20 and start looking at the scholium here, and he gives a few ways of outlining how we can actually use our mind here. Now, I'm going to paraphrase these just to make it a little easier. So number one, he says, just by getting to know them and understand them, right? Studying them, focus on them, learning on them, getting to know these definitions and what they mean, how they affect us. Two, by separating them from external causes, realizing that the effects are from within you, they are of your mind, and yes, things may seem to cause them, but ultimately you are in control of them. It's going back to this very Stoic idea. Three, by focusing on those we understand rather than those that are confusing. Eventually, we do want to clear that confusion of all the effects, but for starters, we do want to focus on the ones we understand and go from there. The fourth point, by encouraging common effects in those of God, right? Again, maybe going away from the ones that confuse us at first, and ideas and effects and emotions and love of God is always encouraged by Spinoza. And finally, the fifth one, by managing them. He actually uses the word ordering them, but managing them and connecting them to one another, understanding how all the effects are related. Before moving on with Proposition 20 and that scholium, I just want to kick back to something we already looked at all the way back in the second part when Spinoza goes over the three kinds of knowledge. So it's going to come up again here, actually, in his final part. It's going to become pretty important. Just as a quick review, the first kind of knowledge is imagination and opinions. Second kind of knowledge, reason, common notions, and adequate, or those clear and distinct ideas. And finally, the third kind of knowledge, which is he calls intuition or true understanding. And again, a little quote here, just essentially that relates them to being of God in some way, shape, or form. So now once we have that under our belt again, once we reviewed that, going back to Proposition 20, the rest of that scholium, to kind of give a quote here, Spinoza says, from what we have said, we easily conceive what clear and distinct knowledge, and especially that third kind of knowledge, that intuition, that true understanding, whose foundation is the knowledge of God itself, can accomplish against the effects. He continues, insofar as the effects are passions or impulses, if clear and distinct knowledge or adequate knowledge does not absolutely remove them, at least it brings it about that they constitute the smaller part of the mind. So here he's saying that if you can really attack them, manage them, understand them, order them head on, then you're not going to be led by your passions, your impulses. You're really going to start leaning into that knowledge and that love of God, and you'll have more control over your mind, and you'll be finding that freedom. Moving on to Proposition 23. And this one's a little out there. It's not totally backed up. There's definitely some controversy around this claim by Spinoza, but he says the human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains, which is eternal. And that's a little vague. Clearly, he goes on to say in the scholium for that proposition, he says, we feel and know by experience that we are eternal, or that the mind is eternal. And this is, again, equating it to his idea of God, his pantheistic idea of God's nature. He's saying our mind is a part of that, somehow. Something of it remains. Moving on to Proposition 24, he says the more we understand singular things, the more we understand God. That's also why it's in our interest to get to know the effects individually. Understanding them will actually bring us closer to our understanding of God. Proposition 31, he says the third kind of knowledge, again, that's tuition or true understanding related to God, depends on the mind. It's of the mind as on a formal cause, insofar as the mind itself is eternal. Goes back to this big claim we saw above from Proposition 23, right there. That the mind is being directly equated with God at this point. So moving on to Proposition 36, the mind's intellectual love of God is part of the infinite love by which God loves himself. Right, starting to come full circle, connecting it all here. And even if this is really difficult to understand, there is some consolation, some solace provided by Spinoza at the very end. One of my personal favorite quotes from this text, maybe even in all of philosophy. Spinoza leaves us with, and this is the final quote of his entire Ethics, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. I think it's a great one to live by, a great one to meditate on. It definitely helps to give you some reassurance if ethics was difficult on your first time through as well. So for now, I hope this helps.